So the argument here is that we have to focus our treatment intervention programs definitely in the school system, and what I'll argue is you have to start at the level of daycare and preschool. The work that I've been doing in publishing, I just published an article on 5 pathways I touch serious and violent offending. And one pathway I argue is the one that we can deal with most directly and most dramatically is in utero or pregnancy insults. The evidence, again, is overwhelming. The obvious one that I've already alluded to before is binge drinking, particularly binge drinking. There's a debate as to should you drink at all, at any time. Well, I grew up Italian family. The wine was always there, and I know I don't have it, the FASD, but nonetheless, drinking small amounts of wine, but if you binge, then and remember, it only takes once. That's the thing that's so tragic. Just takes one binge and the damage is permanent. So the idea that, for example, now in First Nations, you'll see throughout First Nations buildings and schools, they'll say, don't drink, you don't mix alcohol in pregnancy. So the idea is to try to get to the children in intermediate schools quickly about the binge drinking issue. The second one is smoking, a pack a day. And again, toxicities in the cigarettes cause the permanent brain damage. The third one is malnutrition. As we all know, folic acid, mineral supplements are critically important in central nervous system and even peripheral nervous system development. Very, very important. And one of the most successful programs by far is by Olds and is home nursing. It has been an enormous success. So if you're looking at what interventions have worked effectively, consistently, with low cost, it's clearly the home nurse visiting program. We have it in British Columbia. As soon as your family doctor identifies the pregnancy, it's reported to a public health nurse. The public health nurse automatically visits the home and provides the information and even supplements and follow-up. They have a superb program in France too, where they provide incentives for the mother to raise a healthy baby, and then bonding issues too. The other factor that we've picked up in the brain research is excessive stress. Right? We vastly underestimated the impact of stress, particularly its inflammatory effect, because we find the brain development, the fetal brain development, is affected strongly by the profile of hormones that are going from the mother to the baby's fetal development. So epinephrine, cortisol are extremely damaging inflammatory drugs that can cause major delays in development, brain development. So again, as you know, those who've been through it, one of the biggest concerns that a doctor has during pregnancies is a high fever. And all high fever is the open expression of inflammation in your body, because that inflammation is brought about by antibodies fighting disease. Well, the same effect can come from extreme stress. And what we find within these family profiles, Aboriginal non-profiles, are mothers who lack social capital, which means family resources, extended family resources, neighbors, particularly in urban settings where they're isolated. You're pregnant, in Vancouver, even though I was ahead of chairman of my strata group, I think I only knew 30% of the people in my building. And that was my job, to get to know them. But you can't get to know them. Lifestyles are so mobile today in Canada that you don't really want to get to know your neighbors. So it's the lack of social capital isolates young single-parent mothers dramatically. And that's a stress issue, major stress issue. Because stress is related to sleep, eating patterns, drinking patterns, and drug patterns, strongly correlated. So that's a major concern. The other area that we're concerned about with this early intervention strategies that affect learning capacity is bonding. The attachment theory in psychology has been validated in numerous studies, and part of the research team that I'm working with is a pediatric psychiatrist, Patriba Riba, and a psychologist, Marlene Moretti. And between Patriba and Marlene, they focused on attachment. So in the toddler study that we have going, we were trying to focus on what are the attachment issues for, again, this profile of a family profile. And the attachment issue is often that there are genetic and epigenetic and trauma reasons for not bonding with your baby. So that's why daycares become important. Home nurse visits to identify the troubled mother that can't cope. You don't take the baby away, you just provide additional resources so that there's a bonding dynamic. The bonding dynamic is directly related to fetal brain development and learning skill development. If you remember the famous case of the Romanian babies, by the time they actually found them, they had been abandoned and not dealt with for months. And it's interesting, the older children suffered more damage. So the brain plasticity in the younger babies was even more. But the older you get, your ability of the brain to overcome the lack of stimulation is even less. So these are the types of issues that I think we've downplayed, ignored, don't want to face, the isolation of the mother and the lack of bonding. And it's absolutely hormonal. It has to do with oxytocin and lectin, and that can be affected dramatically by alcohol. Alcohol, again, is one of those toxic that break down the positive hormones and accentuate the negative hormones. So what we find then, the third set of issues, the bonding are important because it leads to the security of the baby and development of the baby, the eye contact. And interesting, in the studies that are coming out of the Chicago Human Resource Study, the big study of these classic families that have low social capital, is the number of gestures and talking and language and how you relate to your baby is a function of education and income. And what they're showing is development. The more you're gesturing your babies and handling your babies, and you're stimulating their brains, because that leads to the next development phase, picking up verbal skills. And that starts, as you know, roughly between 1.5 to 2 years old. And it's verbal skill development that becomes important. And if you look at Richard Tremblay's work at the University of Montreal, he had the classic study of toddlers. And what he shows, again, in his working class sample, is the ability to stimulate the child at 2 to 3 years old is critical, because that's the point at which natural violence or aggression in children, because Richard argues, and there's a lot of support for it, babies lack the capacity to think through their impulsivity. Right? By 2 years old, by 1 year old, you have no idea that when you grab hair or pull glasses, you have no idea what you're doing. It's there, you grab. So there's a natural tendency to grab, pull, but then gradually you learn that the word no, obviously, and then you start to develop the ability to substitute verbal ability, personality to get what you want versus violence. Richard argues quite strongly, if you're not taught that contributes to the small group of children whose aggression and violence does not peak at 4 years old, but stays high, and then stays high for good. So that's that tiny sample. That's very important to study. That translates into these types of behavior over here. Fighting and bullying. It's often those kids that don't learn to control those impulses. Even a recent study showing that can be the most popular kids in the school. So it isn't just those kids that are marginalized, and it can be kids that we have this case in Vancouver, in Victoria. She led an informal gang. She was the leader. There was also a male that was the other leader. One of the East Indian girl gang members who was accused of having sexual relations with another gang member, they tricked her into going to this little bridge area where they meet. They proceeded to burn her and beat her for a couple hours. And then as she staggered across the bridge, the two leaders, led by Kelly Eller, the girl, they followed her across the bridge. On the other side, they brought her down to the waterfront, and she proceeded to break every bone in her body and drown her. And yet, when you saw her on television, because she had trials when she was an adult, She was so charming and and very attractive, and you would never know it. And in some of the initial analysis said, oh, she's absolutely very charming. Well, her nickname was Killer Kelly. So it's not just the marginalized kid. It isn't just that. So then it means we're looking at personality and temperament issues. And personality and temperament issues cut across all income groups, all ethnic racial groups, which is leading me a bit towards my work on psychopathy. It shows up in any income group. So, but the problems with school are evident very early. So the intervention programs have to be early. And the earlier the intervention, the more adaptive the child is to overcoming delays. That's just the nature of brain plasticity and learning in toddlers. As you know, children between 2 and 4 can pick up multiple languages with any trouble. As you get older, it becomes harder. As Peter and I know, as we try to remember French and other things that we grew up with. So this is why we argue over and over again that we need to focus here, because this is where the program impacts are the greatest. Because by the time they get to grade 1 particularly, the correlation between school failure in grade 1 and serious and violent offending is extremely high. And within the Aboriginal community, the second problem, the compounded problem, is they're moving to schools that are overwhelmingly mixed race. So the challenge there is cultural too, fitting in, stereotypes. Because what we find very early on, there is kid stereotyping and teacher stereotyping. It can be extremely dangerous. Teachers' expectations, for example, if they have lower expectations to you, you'll fulfill those lower expectations, and the inverse applies to the converse, that the higher the expectations, the more the kids will rise. What we get from the teachers when we're looking at some of these programs is they lack the training. They're not trained to deal with these youth coming in with these particular profiles. And then when we ask the education policy makers what's going on, they'll say, well, these kids are too difficult to deal with because typically they're comorbid with ADD or ADHD or all the ones I laid out before. That's what you see. And these are the kids that have very strong difficulties just adapting to a school situation where you have to sit for X number of hours. It's just not in their capacity. Consequently, they develop label. They're labeled by the kids, and they're labeled by the teachers as troublesome, bothersome, and then they start to self-identify, the classic self-labeling and external labeling, where you think of yourself as a bully and you act like a bully. It's a classic Lemmert's labeling theory. It starts that early. You have to wait till you're 14. It can start down at 6 and 7 years old. So the cumulative effect comes all the way through here.